This presentation is a version of one that was given in July 2023 to a conference at the Black Country Museum entitled A Landscape at the End of the World, the Industrial Revolution in the Black Country, 1706 to 1914. The presentation itself is called A Tale of Two Maps, the 1822 and 1840 Fowler maps of King Swynford. But first of all, just where is King Swynford? King Swynford, as you can see there on that map, shown in hatched red, is to the west of Dudley, to the north of Stourbridge, on the very western edge of the Black Country. The Fowler maps of King Swynford. In 1822, a map was produced for the proprietors of the estates within the said parish by William Fowler Limited at 10 chains to the inch. It lists 2,000 proprietors in a book of reference, and also the occupiers, proprietors' names, descriptions, the area, and so on. A revision was made in 1840 as a tithe map. There's less detail there in the book of reference, but obviously tithe details are included. The interval between the two maps corresponds to the period of the industrialisation of large parts of the parish. Industrialisation came very late to this part of the Black Country, so we're able to see the spread of it in some detail. But if we look at the maps are really quite tremendous things, and we can see the 1822 and 1840 versions there. If we look at the 1822 version in a little more detail, the important thing to notice is that north is to the top right. I suspect this is because it fits on the page better, if that's how it's done. To help with understanding, in some of the smaller maps I show, which will be oriented in the normal way with north to the top, I'll show throughout the presentation 3 townships marked as red spots: King Swynford, Wordsley and Brierley Hill, to help us get a sense of where we are on the maps. So that's the map. The directories look like that. They're very detailed. The 1822 one in particular, it contains indications of the occupiers, the proprietors, the premises, and the areas in acres, rods, and perches, and some notes as well for various plots. The basic research methodology I used was to take these directories and to transcribe them into Excel spreadsheets. Perhaps one of the most mind-numbingly tasks I've ever completed, certainly on a par with marking undergraduate exam scripts. And but once it's been done, it allows all sorts of games to be played to order the columns by proprietor, by occupier, by area, and so on. There are different ways of interrogating these maps. There's what you might call a synoptic way of looking at them in the big picture sense. How are they changing between 1822 and 1840? We can look at places in detail. We can look at people in detail. For this presentation, though, I'm going to take the synoptic approach. In particular, I'm going to look at the growth of industry and community between 1822 and 1840. But first, before we go on, a health warning. This talk contains numbers. Numbers, I suspect, have much the same effect on the physiology of historians as the COVID virus. So come with me on what will be, I hope, a socially distanced walk through the numbers of the Fowler maps. First of all, I'll talk about topography. Then I'll talk about the great and the good, question mark, the proprietors. Then talk about the spread of industry. Then talk about the not so great, King Swynford society. And then at the end, take a slightly longer view. But in terms of topography, there we have the parish shown, this time with north to the top. And you can see the 3 townships, as I said, of King Swynford, Worsley and Brierley Hill marked in red. In 1822, the size of the parish of King Swynford was much larger than the current size. It still contained considerable areas of woodland. You can see it was more or less completely defined by water. The Holbeach Brook to the north and the rivers Smestow and Stour to the west and the south. And really to the east there was an area of fen. So it was really defined by water. The other defining part of the parish is that chain dotted line, now marked in red. And that actually shows the boundary of the South Staffs coalfield, which was to have a major effect on how the parish developed. The parish has had by 1822 a history of enclosures. In the central part of the parish, the common fields were enclosed by agreement, not by Parliament, in 1685. These were formalised, and the western part of the parish enclosed in the Ashwood Hay enclosure of 1776, and that was followed fairly quickly by the Pensnett Chase enclosure to the east of the parish in 1784. The area in between are called old enclosures, and these were estates that gradually formed over the course of the centuries. So gradual enclosure, amalgamation of plots. And insofar as I'm going to be talking about places, I'm going to be talking particularly about these. So at the north we have the Oak Farm estate, a little below it the Shut End estate, the Corbins Hall estate, the Child House estate, and the Bromley House estate. And these go back some generations, particularly I think Corbins Hall. Okay, so let's move on. What was the place like in 1822? In 1822, there were loads of farms around in the western edge of the parish, and they're shown by the black dots there. And some of those farms indeed still exist, some of the farming, even if they're not farms themselves these days. But also in the southeast of the parish, there was an area of crofts. This was a newly enclosed area of the parish, and it seems that the Dudley estate, who owned most of this land, actually encouraged crofts to presumably bring the enclosed land into some sort of order for agriculture. But we just didn't have farms and crops in 1820. But in 1822, we just didn't just have farms and crofts, we also had significant industry, particularly around the Brierley Hill and Wordsley areas. Top figure shows the mines that existed in 1822 as black squares. The bottom figure shows the ironworks as solid squares, and the glassworks, particularly around Wordsley, as open squares. So there was considerable industry in 1822. But let's look at the great and the good, the proprietors. One thing was, in 1822, 50% of the total area was owned by just 3 proprietors. Huge estates. And a further 25% by just another 13. There were actually 450 proprietors in total. Let's look at some of these people very briefly. The first of these was the Dudley estate, Lord Dudley, who owned 862 hectares. And at the time, that was William Ward, the 8th Baron Ward, 3rd Viscount Dudley and Ward. As I say, owned an awful lot of land. The second was John Foley, or rather John Hodgetts Foley. There were Hodgetts, John Hodgetts indeed, in Kings Swinford for many, many centuries before the Fowler maps, and they were very skillful in the marriages they entered, and gradually they climbed up the social scale. Their particular peak came when they married into the Foley family, and in 1822 John Hodgetts Foley lived at Presswood in the southwest of the parish, but owned considerable land there and elsewhere. The Keeling trustees, these are the trustees of John Keeling, who died in 1784, almost 40 years before. But obviously his estate hadn't been completely settled. Keeling was steward of the Dudley estate, and his residence was at Summerhill House, which actually still exists. Some perhaps surprising names: Jonathan Stokes. This is the Jonathan Stokes of the Lunar Society. Um, and he held considerable lands in the parish. Um, don't quite know where they came from, but he certainly had a major landholding. Going on to 1840, when there were 800 proprietors in total. Still, we have the Dudley estate as a major landowner. At this time, the Dudley estate was in trusteeship. The actual lord of the Dudley estate was William Ward, 11th Baron Ward, first Earl of Dudley, in second creation some years later, first Viscount Etnam. As I say, it was still held by trustees at the time, which is probably a good thing, as he was in his student gambling days at the time that this map was written. John Foley was there, but also James Foster, whom many of you will know. James Foster owned many ironworks around the Midlands, not least the Shut End Ironworks in the north of the parish. The Briscoe estate seems to have been split amongst the Keeling estate, seems to have been split between a number of people, largely Richard Homer, who held it in the partnership of Homer, Dudley and Briscoe, and by himself. Richard Homer hailed from Ettingshaw in Sedgley, and he had mined the area around his house there to such an extent it was no longer fit for gentlemen to live in. So he came to the Bromley estate and pretty much carried on doing the same until that wasn't fit for a gentleman to live in. Other major landowners, the Gibbons, John and Benjamin Gibbons, and there's a bit of Corbyn's Hall, and there's a picture of Ben Gibbons in his old age, there with major works, as we'll see, in the Corbyn's Hall area. Edward Addenbrooke. The Addenbrooks were old established Kingsford family, glassmakers, ironworkers, and indeed the Addenbrooks that we've probably all heard of, the Addenbrooks of Cambridge, who John Addenbrooke, who founded Addenbrooke's Hospital there, all hail from Kingsford, and there we can see John Addenbrooke's gravestone, John Addenbrooke to Swinford Regis, and that's in the chapel of St Catherine's College in Cambridge. My wife and I walked over him when we got married. There were, of course, industrial owners, and in particular the Stourbridge and Dudley Canal Companies. Stourbridge Canal had been built in 1784. And then we have others, and I mention here the late Richard Mee of the Tiled House estate. I'll let you read that thing on the screen. It's actually an entry in Dudley Archives that tries to describe the tangled mess of the financial situation of the Tiled House at the time. A full description of the legal and equitable nightmares surrounding this estate between 1790s and the 1840s is impossible. The archivist then goes on to describe it and ends with a wonderful phrase: other bankruptcies, insolvencies and imprisonments for debt just muddy the waters. I think that is possibly the best archive entry I've ever read, and whoever wrote it deserves a literary prize, I think. Going down the list a little, we come to the Oak Farm Colliery. The Oak Farm, the ironworks was to come into prominence rather later, of course, when there was the Oak Farm crash. It was owned by the Glynn family. Stephen Glynn, an antiquarian really, lived in North Wales. It had to be sorted out by his brother-in-law, William Gladstone. Okay, so if we now look then at those holdings a little more, we can see that throughout it all, Lord Dudley was a prominent landholder. If you look at those numbers at the top of the columns, they dwarf the numbers in all the other estate holders in terms of farms, crofts, industry and residential. The total in 1822 was 146 acres of industrial and 180 acres of residential in the parish. If we flick on to 1840, we find that industrial has doubled to 299, and residential also has increased quite significantly to 210. So that takes us on to look at industry. We begin by looking at the canals, railways and tramways. In 1822, we had the Stourbridge Canal in the southern part of the parish that met with the Dudley Canal. The large area to the north was devoid of transport links, and this made exploitation of any of the resources that were there very difficult. So the landowners, in particular, Hodgetts, Dudley and Foley, were instrumental in building the King Swinford Railway, which many folk will know about, and Adyan Horia ran on, and were also instrumental in building the Stourbridge Extension Canal. And also around the central area of the parish, a whole system of tramways developed. In 1822, as I've said before, there were coal mines basically at the southern part, southeastern part of the parish. By 1840, with the improved transport links, these had spread significantly northwards. With the spread of coal mines, there was also the spread of old colliery land and spoil, waste as it's often called in the directory, and again a spread from south to north. Iron and glass works, as I said, in 1822, there are iron works mainly along the canals for obvious transport reasons, and a significant and well-established glassworks industry in Wordsley. By 1840, the ironworks had spread significantly to the north. Glassworks, not so much, they were fairly stable. So again, the northerly movement. Brick, slightly different story here. In 1822, their brickworks, the major ones, were indeed in the south and east of the parish, but there were also a lot of small pits, really, marl pits, in the northern part of the parish, in the agricultural part. By 1840, these seem to have disappeared, and there was a consolidation and also some degree of northward movement. So you can see a spread of industry from south to north, very, very rapid. That's the important thing. In just 17 or 18 years, huge changes. But then let's think about the not so great. King Swinford Society and the occupiers of the land. In 1822, there were 44 industrial occupiers on the left-hand side. Interestingly, if we look at the land they occupied, most frequently any one occupier would take land from 3 or 4 people to build their particular works on. Complicated pattern, and many of them had what you might call multi-industry concerns going. So with ironworks, coal mines, and so on, or ironworks and glass houses, whatever. By 1840, there were 75 industrial occupiers, so quite a lot more come into it. But we can see the same trend of initial occupiers taking land, renting land from a number of proprietors with multi-discipline conglomerates working there. If we look particularly at Matthew Dudley and co. there, they took land in the Corbins Hall and Tart House areas from Gibbons and Mee and others, and they had furnaces, coal pits, ironstone pits, and so on. In terms of the population itself, the population had grown hugely over time. From 1821 to 1841, it had pretty much doubled. And if we look where all those people had come from, we go to the 1851 census, and I show their age bands, 0 to 19, 20 to 39, 40 to 59, and so on. And of those older age bands, only about 30 to 40% had actually originated, been born in the parish itself. A similar number had come from the surrounding counties, and in particular Shropshire. So it was very much a migrant society, and I suspect a society with some social tension because of that. In residential terms, there are 188 hectares of residential in 1822, 2,215 plots. They varied hugely in size from Mary Mail in Shut End with 0.95 hectares, about the size of a cricket ground, to Mary Cook in Shut End with much smaller, about 0.0025 hectares, which is about the size of a boxing ring, and they were actually over the road from each other. There were only 13% of the total were owner-occupiers. Mostly folk had tenancies from the Dudley estates. But as with industry, so with other aspects of society. In terms of churches and chapels, in 1822 there was a parish church of St Mary's, and there was a chapel, Brierley Hill Chapel, dedicated to St Michael. And there were a few nonconformist meeting houses in open squares. By 1840, we have Holy Trinity Wordsley, the replacement parish church, because folk were worried that St Mary's was going to collapse because of subsidence. And there was also a nascent Anglican present in Pensnett, but only at chapel level. And there'd been a huge expansion of nonconformist meeting houses. Again, same sort of direction. Schools, one has to use one's imagination a little more, but perhaps there was that similar sort of south-north spread. Public houses, unfortunately, we only have 1822 data there, but I can assure you that pubs spread equally into the Pensnett area, but we don't have precise data from the maps. What I find there is that particularly impressive cluster around Wordsley. It's worthy of unpacking a bit, I think, and some of those pubs actually still exist. So as we come to a close, I want us to look at one particular area, the area that was to become Pensnett, around the Corbins Hall and Tiled House estates, and see how that developed between the two maps. Here we see, go back to the original maps, so north is to the right. And we can see Shut End House there, which is very much a country gentleman's house. Corbins Hall, again, a country gentleman's house at the time, surrounded by fields and ornamental pools. The Tiled House with its orchards. Barrow Hill Coppice, the Lady Coppice, owned by Lord Dudley. Very rural around there. The only sign of industry coming into it were the canal feeder pools at the bottom edge there. By 1840, things were a little different. This time we have an ironworks at Corbins Hall. We have mines. We have canals. We have the Kingsford Railway. We have tramways. And in the bottom right, we have a complete new village planted there by the Dudley estate, Pensnett itself. And around that, they gathered all the usual facilities, and these are the nonconformist chapels, or a nonconformist and Anglican chapel at the time. So again, this huge, rapid expansion over a very limited time period speaks of great energy, great desire to get the resources out. But let's take a bit of a longer view. In 1822, if we look at the Shut End area, we've got Kingsford by the red dot. Shut End Hall I've marked with green. Between the two of them, we've got this avenue of trees. The hall at that time was owned by the Hodgetts, leased Thomas Dudley, and he would have had a pretty idyllic view looking out over this avenue of trees leading down to the centre of Kingsford village. By 1840, things were a bit different. The hall had been replaced by the Shut End furnaces. The Kingsford Railway had appeared with an incline leading to the furnaces. The Stourbridge Extension Canal had appeared. By 1880, and here's the 1880 Ordnance Survey map, so we've got north at the top, same sort of area. We've got this huge concentration of railways, canals, mines. Just get the impression of it there. By 1910, that had become fundamentally an area of waste. And that area of waste persisted. This is a view from 1925. We have the tiled house estate, the old tiled house estate at the top, with a set of council houses there. The area marked is actually the top of a slag heap. We have the Corbins Hall estate in the bottom. And this is a personal talk, of course, because I spent the first 18 years of my life there. The area at the bottom was my playground. Some final thoughts. The Fowler maps of 1822 and 1840 show very rapid industrial development across the parish. Development was driven by the Dudley estate and other major industrialists, with many others following. Societal developments also followed in terms of pubs, schools and churches. Environmental degradation also followed in the wake of industry. There's much more to be said about the development of the townships and of individuals, perhaps on a less quantitative level, but that's for other occasions, of course. Other work to be done, correlation with the 1841 census, the Dudley Estate rent books, that'd be interesting. Use of GIS, that's a drawback of this. If these were in GIS, life would be a lot easier. Christian name, surname analysis, field name research, and so on. But perhaps this is a sort of methodology that could be applied elsewhere in the Black Country. And of course, it's an ongoing resource for social and family history. So I want to say, if you want to have any more information, folks, go to my website. There's an awful lot of stuff there that you can play around with. I'm happy to answer questions.